Go back to last summer and put yourself in Tony Bennett's shoes. You've built up Virginia to one of the most dominant programs in college basketball over the last 5 seasons, with a total of 73 ACC wins. The powerhouses of your league, Duke and North Carolina, had just 63 over that same time period. You've been by far the #1 defensive program in the country in those 5 years, according to KenPom's adjusted efficiency, and a solid number 22 offensively. You've even had 3 #1 seeds in those 5 years, tied for the most in the country with Kansas and Villanova. You're also coming off really your most successful regular season of all time and have a great nucleus coming back. On the other hand, you just became the first ever 1 seed to lose to a 16, and it's certainly up for debate if the unique style of play you implement with your teams contributed to that upset. But keep in mind, it's the same exact style of play that won those 73 ACC games. To top it all off, your father essentially invented the schemes which ultimately make Virginia so unique: the blocker mover offense and the pack line defense. So do you change everything because of one shocking and historical loss? Do you just make some minor tweaks, or do you stay the same? Well, after winning the jump ball in November in the season opener against Towson, we got our first hint at the answer. Virginia did not come out in their traditional blocker mover offense. Instead, they came out in one of the most common offenses run by teams all around the NCAA: continuity ball screen. It's similar to blocker mover in that it's a fairly rigid, continuity-based system with the same actions happening over and over again. But the actions themselves and the spacing are very different. Continuity ball screen was a summer adjustment to losing to UMBC, but it would be pretty wrong to just simply credit it for the national championship and move on. In fact, Virginia got off to an extremely slow start in the Towson game, and 3 minutes in, having not scored a field goal, were right back into their traditional blocker mover. Their first basket of the season was on a Jack Salt post-up out of the blocker mover. Throwing it into the post is kind of a safety net for the blocker mover, but it's not necessarily super efficient. Salt's post-up usage in particular decreased throughout the season, partially in conjunction with the rise of Mamadi Diakite, but more on that later. After 4 minutes of blocker mover, Virginia did get their first continuity ball screen basket of the season, fittingly on a Kihei Clark empty ball screen reject. Clark continued to reject ball screens for baseline drives throughout the season, including the NCAA tournament. But going back to the season opener, it was the blocker mover which finally got the offense rolling. Ty Jerome and Kyle Guy both hit threes off pin downs, which is the staple of the offense. And then when Towson got over worried about the pin down itself, Jerome hit the first boomerang 3 of the season. A few days later in game number 2 against George Washington, it was Guy's turn this time to hit 3 boomerang jumpers. And just like that, even though continuity ball screen had been a point of emphasis to start the season, the blocker mover came out of the gate as the more efficient offense. They didn't ditch continuity ball screen altogether, but non-conference play was dominated by the traditional blocker mover. They ran blocker mover almost the entire second half against Towson before going back to the ball screens at the end, where Jay Huff got his first dunk of the season off an empty side roll. Again, a play that we would see very often during Huff's minutes increase in ACC play, before mostly being relegated to the bench in the postseason. We also got our first glance at Virginia's ability to mesh both offenses together. Here they look like they're getting into blocker mover, but it's actually continuity ball screen in disguise. And we would see the opposite at times during the season as well. Here to open the game against Virginia Tech, they start ball screening only to quickly jump right into the blocker mover. Besides for the scheme, the lineups were also being adjusted throughout the season. This is game number 2 of the season, and Tony Bennett tried Jack Salt and Jay Huff in at the same time. By the time the NCAA tournament rolled around, neither were playing particularly often, let alone both at the same time. And that's not to say senior Jack Salt wasn't a big part of this year's Virginia team, but it was more matchup dependent. Salt is as good as anyone in the country in ball screen defense. The pack line requires bigs to hedge and recover, a Jack Salt specialty. The pack line also usually consists of double teaming the post, but against Wisconsin, Tony Bennett adjusted from that and decided to give Salt the responsibility of guarding Ethan Happ all on his own. Salt was able to hedge ball screens and then still fight through cross screens to guard the post in a way few bigs could. Aggressively hedging is a somewhat old school way of defending ball screens. You don't see it much in the NBA anymore. In the first half of the opening game of the tournament, Gardner-Webb gave Virginia a scare, taking advantage of Diakite's hedge by slipping screens. But it was the same exact hedging from Diakite that all but shut down what was, in my opinion, the single hardest action to guard in the country this season: Purdue's speed pin downs into dribble handoffs and ball screens. Diakite was awesome defensively in that game and took the majority of Salt's minutes during the tournament. But Purdue going big enabled Bennett to play both in the Elite Eight. Even here, when Purdue finally did get the slip, Diakite sniffed it out and protected the rim. Diakite had a breakout tournament really on both ends of the floor. In conference play, it looked like Jay Huff might be the guy who could give an added offensive punch as a roller and finisher while still protecting the rim. But actually, Diakite took that role in March, and Huff averaged just 3 minutes a game in the tourney. More minutes for Diakite, plus the continued development of the 3 existing stars, turned this year's Virginia team into an elite offense. Don't let the slow pace fool you. Coppin State, Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech, Syracuse, Purdue, Boston College, Maryland, Texas Tech, and Dayton all have something in common. Their worst game of the season in terms of points per possession allowed on defense all came against Virginia. Virginia finished second in the country in adjusted offensive efficiency, and they actually didn't really lose a single game all year long because of the offense. In the 3 losses, Duke twice and Florida State once, Virginia scored over 1 point per possession in all 3. It was the defense that struggled to get stops. In loss number 1 against Duke, it was legitimately shocking to see so many relatively easy drives against the pack line defense that's designed to take those drives away. And that's a big testament to Zion Williamson and RJ Barrett. In loss number 2 against Duke, Virginia stayed in the gaps of the pack line a little bit longer to prevent those drives, but this time Duke, a team that struggled shooting from 3 for most of the year, got hot from outside. In loss number 3 against Florida State, it was the size of Kumaji and Kabengele which gave the pack line trouble. Florida State shot 67% from inside the arc. So yes, Tony Bennett's teams have generally been defensive first throughout his career, but not this one. And that was first and foremost a function of the personnel, and maybe in some part thanks to an increased point of emphasis to improve on the offensive end. Other misguided narrative about Tony Bennett teams is the idea that he doesn't adjust, whether it's in-game adjustments or between-game adjustments. And I can't necessarily speak to previous years, but it just was not the case in 2019. One of the more notable coaching adjustments came against Syracuse. For the most part, Virginia likes to put DeAndre Hunter at the foul line area of their zone offense. But against Syracuse, they put Jerome in the middle instead. In Boeheim's zone, the 5-man is responsible for the foul line area while the guards fan out to defend the 3. So Bennett had his playmaking guard Jerome dribble Pascal Chukwu out onto the perimeter. Then we have 3 of their biggest games of the season, the Duke games and Texas Tech. Coach K and Chris Beard, with all their length and athleticism on their respective rosters, employed the same exact defensive strategy: switch everything. Instead of having Zion chase Jerome through the pin down here in Virginia's blocker mover, Bolden simply switches out to create a turnover. And Texas Tech, somewhat by coincidence, guards pin downs the same exact way. Here they are in the national semifinal game, switching just like we saw Duke. Again, Virginia's offense performed well in the Duke games. The switching didn't really limit the overall efficiency, but what it did do was force Tony Bennett to almost entirely adjust his scheme. The blocker mover offense that was so effective all year long was hardly used in all 3 of those games, and especially in the second halves of those games. In the first Duke game, the initial adjustment was to bring back the continuity ball screen offense in full force. The spacing of that offense really spread out a Duke team that likes getting in the passing lanes and gambling, which then opened the floor for baseline drives. When Virginia went to the continuity ball screen in the second game, this time they looked to attack the switching with high-low passes. Again, this was effective because of Duke's pressure and deny priorities on defense. But Texas Tech has different priorities from Duke. Here's the same type of high-low pass, but Tech off-ball defenders are always looking to help. You can try to spread them out, but they will sink to the level of the ball to fly around and help anyways. Those baseline drives and continuity ball screen that worked against Duke are extremely difficult against Texas Tech's no-middle defense. Texas Tech wants you to drive baseline, so a new adjustment by Bennett was to clear the help defender out as the baseline drive was occurring. That forced the defender to make a decision to stay and help as the low man or let his teammates step up instead. A third offense that's not the blocker mover or the continuity ball screen also emerged in the games versus Duke, and it would eventually become the primary offense for the national championship game against Texas Tech. Coach K referred to it as Virginia's triangle offense, and Virginia signals for it on the floor with 3 fingers. But the biggest difference is that most of the action takes place in the middle third of the floor. DeAndre Hunter was a big beneficiary of the middle third offense. Virginia used it to put Hunter in isolation situations at the top of the key against Duke and also against Auburn in the Final Four. Against Texas Tech's no-middle defense, it was almost inevitable that the middle third offense would take center stage. And Hunter responded by having one of his best offensive games of the season. Virginia actually entered this game having been on a roll with their blocker mover. It was their primary offense in the second half against Oregon, for almost the whole game against Purdue, and for most of the game against Auburn. But again, the switching of Texas Tech limits some of the effectiveness of that blocker mover and turned Virginia into an isolation and ball screen team. Credit Tony Bennett for making that adjustment, but also credit the players for being really good. Virginia wasn't just a system team, they were a talented team. Down the stretch versus both Duke and Texas Tech, the ball was put in the hands of Ty Jerome. On the season, 33% of Jerome's plays were from isolation situations. In those 3 games against the switching defenses, 43% of Jerome's plays were from isolation. In the national championship game, Virginia ran 5 Ty Jerome spread ball screens in a row with no player movement or screening beforehand. That's a far cry from the blocker mover offense. Jerome wasn't perfect, and to be fair, nobody was all year long against Texas Tech's defense, but he has a great ability to balance out being both a distributor and a scorer when he's attacking off the bounce. So Virginia did have more bullets in the chamber this season. Blocker mover was still the most used option, but there were games where it wasn't. They could go to the continuity ball screen, they could go to the middle third, or they could just spread out and let the players make plays. But even with the tweaks and adjustments, Tony Bennett's detailed and methodical system was never really compromised. Virginia still had the second slowest offensive possession length of any team in the country this season. They still packed it in on defense by getting in the gaps and not really trying to turn you over. And that scheme, which was supposedly doomed to fail in March, won a national championship. But look, so much luck or randomness goes into a single elimination 68-team tournament. Just like Virginia was on the wrong side of that randomness in the 2016 Elite Eight against Syracuse, or last year against UMBC, they were fortunate to be on the right side this year against Purdue, Auburn, and Texas Tech. Before it was Tony Bennett that couldn't get to a Final Four, it was someone like Mark Few or Bo Ryan. A wildly successful regular season coach only has a coaching style that can't get you to the Final Four until it does get you to the Final Four. Tony Bennett was one of the premier coaches in the country before this tournament ever started, and that remains true today.